A trailblazing black executive, fresh off a historic business deal, ready to celebrate her success, walks into a luxurious first-class lounge at a major airport. But what happens next turns triumph into turmoil. A gate agent, dripping with condescension, blocks her entry, demanding proof she belongs there, humiliating her in front of other travelers. Just 10 minutes later, the tables are turned, and the outcome sends shockwaves across the industry in a way no one could have foreseen. Stay with me. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive into it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if stories of resilience and justice move you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales that inspire and challenge us all. It was supposed to be a routine stop at the airport, but nothing about what unfolded that day was routine. The terminal was alive with the familiar chaos of travel. Rolling suitcases clattering against polished tiles, boarding announcements reverberating through the air, and a medley of voices. Some hurried, others languid, weaving together a tapestry of sound. Eliza Freeman stepped through the glass doors, her figure a study in composure, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit with a silk scarf draped across her shoulders. She exuded the quiet confidence of someone who had navigated rooms where her presence was neither expected nor always welcomed. This trip wasn't leisure, it was business. Geneva awaited, with its polished boardrooms and negotiations that would decide the future of her career. But before she could take her seat at the table, there was the small matter of getting there. Eliza had splurged on a first-class ticket for this journey. A rare indulgence, but one she had deemed necessary for the occasion. This flight was not merely transportation, it was the prelude to a pivotal moment. She followed the signs to the priority check-in counter, her heels clicking a steady rhythm against the tile. The line was short, populated by other travelers whose clothes and demeanor spoke of privilege and status. Eliza tightened her grip on her leather tote bag, reminding herself to maintain the poise she had perfected over years of learning to navigate spaces that seemed intent on testing her worth. When her turn came, she stepped forward with a polite smile and presented her passport and ticket to the young attendant behind the counter. His name tag read Ryan, and his neatly pressed uniform seemed at odds with the faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good morning," Eliza said, her tone warm but professional. Ryan barely glanced at her documents before raising his eyes to meet hers. There was a flicker of something in his gaze. Curiosity, perhaps, but layered beneath it was something else. Something colder. "This line is for priority passengers," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, as though addressing a child. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Eliza felt the question land, sharp and unwelcome, but her years of experience tempered her response. "I'm certain," she replied evenly, offering a hint of a smile. "I believe everything is in order." Ryan hesitated, then picked up her ticket as though it were counterfeit. He examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, flipping it over once, twice, before turning back to his screen. His fingers moved across the keyboard, but the subtle roll of his eyes didn't escape Eliza's notice. She glanced around, aware of the growing attention from nearby travelers. Some offered polite disinterest, their gazes skimming over her before returning to their phones. Others lingered a moment too long, their expressions unreadable but heavy with assumption. Ryan said after a few moments, his voice laced with faint concern. "It looks like there might be an issue with your ticket. I'll need to double-check." Eliza straightened, her smile faltering ever so slightly. "And what exactly is the issue?" "Well," Ryan began, his tone growing more condescending with each syllable, "it's not showing as valid in our system. I'll have to call someone to verify." A ripple of murmurs began to spread among the other travelers. Eliza could feel the weight of their collective judgment pressing against her. Unspoken but unmistakable, she took a deep breath. The warmth of her earlier confidence replaced by a cool, steely resolve. Ryan reached for the phone, his expression betraying a hint of satisfaction, as though he had caught her in a lie. Eliza, however, had seen this play before. It was a script as old as the air she breathed, doubting her, dismissing her, making her justify her existence in a space she had every right to occupy. She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering to a calm but firm register. "I'd suggest you check again, Mr. Ryan." I purchased this ticket directly from your airline. First class. Priority boarding. I trust you understand the importance of accuracy in your role. The sharpness of her words cut through the moment. And for an instant, Ryan faltered. He fumbled with the phone. His confidence momentarily shaken, but he recovered quickly, his smirk returning as he gestured to a nearby security guard. Just a routine check, Ryan said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. We'll need to ensure everything is in order. The guard approached, his presence adding an air of quiet tension. Eliza remained still, her composure intact, though inside, her frustration simmered. She had prepared for many challenges on this trip. But this wasn't one of them. Or perhaps it was, in its own insidious way. As Ryan explained the situation, embellishing just enough to paint Eliza as the problem, she pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved deftly across the screen as she scrolled to a familiar contact. When the call connected, her voice was steady and deliberate. It's Eliza Freeman, she said, her words carrying an unmistakable weight. I'm at the airport, and there's an issue with the check-in process. Handle it. She ended the call before the voice on the other end could respond. Slipping the phone back into her tote with a deliberate calm, her gaze returned to Ryan, who now looked uncertain, his bravado cracking under the weight of her unwavering composure. Shall we continue? Eliza said, her voice a quiet challenge. The tension thickened, the crowd of onlookers growing as the drama unfolded. Eliza stood tall, her presence commanding respect even in the face of Ryan's thinly veiled disdain. She knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about every moment that had come before. Every battle fought in silence. Every indignity borne with grace. This was only the beginning. The security guard stood at the ready, his gaze flickering uneasily between Eliza Freeman and the check-in attendant. The air between them felt heavy, charged with the kind of tension that everyone could feel but no one would dare name. Around them, the hum of the airport continued, but the immediate vicinity had become a stage, with Eliza as the unwilling protagonist. Ryan, the young man behind the counter, adjusted his tie and straightened his posture, clearly emboldened by the arrival of backup. He was no longer just a clerk questioning her ticket, he had assumed the role of gatekeeper. Protecting the sanctity of a space he seemed to think Eliza didn't belong in. This is a matter of protocol, he said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of false politeness and unspoken judgment. I'm sure you understand. Eliza held his gaze, her calm demeanor unshaken. I understand the importance of protocol, she replied, her tone measured, but I also understand when it's being misused. Her words landed with precision. And for a brief moment, Ryan faltered. The guard, standing to his left, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable, but Ryan wasn't ready to let go of the reins. He gestured toward the documents Eliza had provided. Ma'am, I'll need to make a call to verify these, he said, picking up the phone on the counter. It's just a standard check. As Ryan spoke into the receiver, Eliza could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, their curiosity thinly veiled behind half-hearted attempts at indifference. She heard snippets of their murmurs, small fragments that betrayed the quiet assumptions being made. Maybe she's in the wrong place. Someone whispered. She doesn't look like she'd fly first class. Another voice muttered, barely audible but unmistakable. Eliza's grip on the handle of her tote tightened, though her expression remained composed. She had heard these words before. In other settings, from other mouths. They were the echoes of a larger narrative, one that sought to diminish her, to question her presence in spaces she had every right to occupy. But Eliza was not a woman who allowed herself to be diminished. She stood tall, her posture a silent rebuke to the whispers around her. She let the weight of their gazes settle on her, refusing to shrink beneath it. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Finally, Ryan hung up the phone and turned back to her, his expression a mask of reluctant professionalism. Well, it seems everything checks out, he said, his tone flat. You're cleared to proceed. The announcement should have brought a sense of relief. But it didn't. The words carried no apology, no acknowledgement of the unnecessary scrutiny she had endured. It was a grudging admission. Nothing more. Thank you, Eliza said, her voice cool, She gathered her documents and prepared to move forward. But as she turned, Ryan's voice stopped her. "One more thing," he said, and the smugness had crept back into his tone. "Next time, you might want to double-check your details before coming to the counter. It'll save us all some time." The comment was unnecessary, a parting shot meant to reassert the control he had lost. Eliza paused, her back to him, and for a moment, she considered walking away, but then she turned, her eyes locking onto his with a calm intensity. "Next time," she said, her voice steady, "I trust you'll remember that every customer deserves respect, regardless of what you assume about them." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, before she turned and walked away. Ryan didn't reply, and the guard stood frozen, as if unsure what to do next. The lounge. By the time Eliza reached the priority lounge, she felt the weight of the encounter beginning to press against her resolve. She scanned her boarding pass at the entrance and stepped inside, the muted luxury of the space providing a stark contrast to the tension she had just endured. The soft hum of conversation and the clink of glassware filled the air. But even here, Eliza felt the faint sting of judgment. As she settled into a seat by the window, she noticed a couple seated nearby, a man and a woman, both dressed in the understated elegance that wealth often brings. They glanced at her briefly, their expressions betraying a flicker of surprise before they turned back to their conversation. It was a small thing. Barely a moment, but it was enough. It was always enough. Eliza opened her laptop and began reviewing her notes for the meeting in Geneva. She told herself to focus, to shake off the morning's events. But her mind kept circling back to Ryan's smug expression, the murmurs of the crowd, the weight of their silent questions. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let moments like this derail her. But that was the cruel trick of it all. The way these encounters, so small and seemingly insignificant, could burrow beneath her skin, leaving wounds that were invisible but still deeply felt. A call for accountability. Her phone buzzed on the table, the name Marcus flashing across the screen. She answered quickly, grateful for the interruption. "Eliza," Marcus said, his voice steady and reassuring. "I spoke to the operations manager. They've been informed." "And?" she asked, her tone calm but expectant. "And they're aware that you're not just any passenger." Marcus replied, "The situation is being addressed." Eliza exhaled slowly. "Good. But I don't want this swept under the rug. This isn't just about me, Marcus. It's about a culture that allows people like Ryan to think they can treat customers differently because of what they look like." "Understood," Marcus said. "I'll follow up. In the meantime, focus on your meeting. You've got bigger things to handle." Eliza smiled faintly. "I always do." As she ended the call, Eliza closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the planes taxiing on the runway outside. The morning's events were a reminder of the quiet battles she had fought her entire life. Battles that were as exhausting as they were necessary. But Eliza Freeman was no stranger to adversity. And as she prepared for the flight ahead, she reminded herself of the truth she had carried with her for years. She didn't just belong in these spaces. She was there to claim them. The first-class cabin of the flight was designed to embody ease and privilege. A sanctuary of soft leather seats, plush blankets, and champagne offered before takeoff. Yet for Eliza Freeman, as she settled into her seat, there was no mistaking the subtle shift in energy that rippled through the cabin as she entered. It wasn't overt, it rarely was. Averted gazes, conversations paused mid-sentence, the way the flight attendant hesitated, just slightly, before addressing her. These weren't acts of hostility. But they weren't acts of welcome either. They were the quiet acknowledgments of a line that some believed she had crossed, even as her ticket and presence said otherwise. Eliza had learned to read these moments long ago, and had learned to brace herself against them. But knowing didn't make it easier. The seatmate, seated beside her, was a man in his late 50s, dressed in a tailored gray suit that looked more expensive than it needed to be. His briefcase rested neatly beneath the seat in front of him, and a gold watch glinted at his wrist. He glanced at Eliza as she arranged her things, his expression carefully neutral but tinged with curiosity. "Traveling for business?" he asked after a moment, his tone polite but vaguely dismissive. as if making conversation out of obligation rather than interest. Eliza offered a small smile. Yes, I am. And you? He nodded, adjusting his cufflinks. Same. Heading to a conference in Zurich. Financial sector. Geneva for me, Eliza said, turning her attention to the book in her lap. A signal, subtle but clear, that she wasn't eager for further small talk. The man paused, then shifted in his seat. Geneva, huh? He said, as if testing the words. Big meeting, I assume? Eliza looked up, her smile still intact but her patience thinning. Yes, quite important. He nodded again, though there was a flicker of something in his expression now. Something that suggested he was recalibrating his assumptions about her. The interaction. As the plane ascended, Eliza tried to lose herself in her book. But the attendant's approach drew her attention. The young woman stopped beside Eliza's seat, her polished smile faltering just slightly. Miss Freeman, would you care for something to drink? She asked. Just water, thank you, Eliza replied, her tone neutral. The attendant nodded and turned to her seatmate. And for you, sir? Scotch. Neat, he said, his voice full of the easy authority of someone accustomed to being served. The attendant returned moments later, setting the drinks on their respective trays. Eliza noticed, as she often did, how the attendant's hand lingered slightly longer on the man's tray. Her smile warmer, her demeanor more at ease. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. This was the undercurrent of the world Eliza navigated, where courtesies were doled out unevenly, their scarcity a quiet commentary on who was seen and who wasn't. The conversation. As the flight continued, her seatmate's curiosity got the better of him. So, what do you do? He asked, his tone casual but probing. I run a consulting firm, Eliza said simply. She didn't elaborate, though she could have. She could have mentioned the global clients, the multi-million-dollar deals, the influence she wielded in rooms that few people like her were allowed to enter. But she didn't. She had learned that too much truth could make people uncomfortable. Ah, he said, nodding again. That's impressive. His words sounded genuine, but there was something behind them. A faint note of surprise that he couldn't quite mask. Eliza held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to her book. The incident. A few hours into the flight, a commotion broke out a few rows behind them. A black woman, younger than Eliza, was speaking with one of the flight attendants. The woman's voice was calm but firm, her gestures restrained, yet the attendant's responses were curt. Her posture defensive. Eliza couldn't hear all the details, but it was clear that something had gone wrong. Perhaps a misunderstanding about a seat assignment or a request denied without explanation. As the conversation grew more heated, another passenger, a middle-aged white man, interjected, his tone dripping with condescension. Maybe if you'd just calm down, he said loudly, this wouldn't be such a problem. The woman stiffened, her composure cracking for the first time. I am calm, she said, her voice tight. I'm just asking for what I paid for. The man rolled his eyes. Sure doesn't sound like it. The observers around them, other passengers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from discomfort to disapproval. Eliza's seatmate leaned over slightly, lowering his voice. Some people just like to make a scene, he said, shaking his head. Eliza closed her book, setting it down carefully on the tray table. She turned to him, her expression calm but unyielding. Or maybe, she said quietly, some people are just tired of being treated like they don't belong. The man blinked, taken aback. I didn't mean, quote, I know what you meant, Eliza said, her tone cool. And that's exactly the problem. The reflection. As the flight attendant finally resolved the issue and the cabin settled back into its muted hum, Eliza stared out the window, her reflection faintly visible against the darkening sky. The incident had been resolved, but the damage lingered, a reminder of how easily the fault lines of civility could crack, revealing the biases that lay beneath. It was exhausting, this constant negotiation of space and identity. This battle to assert her humanity in the face of subtle and not so subtle challenges. But Eliza knew she couldn't afford to falter. Not here, not now. For every seat she occupied, for every room she entered, She knew she was carrying more than just herself. She was carrying the weight of history, the burden of expectations, and the quiet hope that her presence might make it easier for those who followed. As the plane cruised through the night sky, Eliza resolved once again to remain steadfast. Because this wasn't just a flight. It was a fight, and she was far from done. The jet lag had not yet set in as Eliza Freeman exited the airport in Geneva. The city greeted her with its measured grace. Its streets clean and orderly. Its air carrying a faint chill of autumn. The polished stone facades and the quiet hum of electric trams reminded her of the layers of wealth and exclusivity this place had cultivated for centuries. It was, in many ways, like the world she had come to inhabit. A world that accepted her presence but never ceased questioning it. Her driver, a neatly dressed man with salt and pepper hair, opened the car door for her. "Bienvenue, Madame Freeman," he said, his voice formal yet warm. Eliza returned his greeting with a polite smile as she slid into the back seat. The car moved smoothly through the streets. But even the luxury of the moment couldn't ease the tension she felt building inside her. The day ahead wasn't just another business meeting. It was a crucible, another space where she would have to prove her worth. Not through her credentials, but through her resilience against the unspoken challenges she knew were waiting. The boardroom. The meeting room was as imposing as it was elegant, a long mahogany table surrounded by high-backed chairs. Its surface gleaming under soft, recessed lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below. The distant Alps standing guard like silent witnesses. The board members were already seated when Eliza arrived. 11 faces turned toward her, their expressions ranging from polite interest to thinly veiled skepticism. They were a mix of older men in dark suits, a few women with sharp eyes and sharper tailoring, and one younger man whose posture betrayed his inexperience. Eliza entered the room with measured steps, her leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Her navy suit was immaculate, her scarf a muted but elegant touch of color. She had dressed deliberately for this moment, knowing that everything about her would be scrutinized. Not just what she said, but how she looked, how she moved, how she existed in space. The introduction. The chair of the board, a man named Etienne Moreau, rose to greet her. He was tall and lean, his silver hair combed back with precision. His handshake was firm, his smile polite but perfunctory. "Madame Freeman," he said in lightly accented English. "Thank you for joining us. We are eager to hear your proposal." "Thank you for the opportunity," Eliza replied, her voice steady, as she took her seat at the head of the table. The conversation began with formalities, introductions, acknowledgements, a brief summary of the agenda. But beneath the surface, Eliza could feel the tension, the quiet current of doubt that rippled through the room. It was there in the way one man avoided her gaze, in the way another leaned back in his chair with arms crossed, as if daring her to impress him. The proposal. Eliza launched into her presentation, her words precise and deliberate. She spoke of market trends, growth projections, and strategic synergies. She outlined her vision with the confidence of someone who had spent years refining her craft, anticipating every question, every challenge. But the questions came, sharper than she had expected. "Your numbers are ambitious," said one board member, his tone carefully neutral. "What makes you confident they're realistic?" Eliza met his gaze without flinching. "Because they're grounded in data," she replied. "I have analyzed the market extensively, and the projections reflect not only current trends but opportunities that have yet to be tapped." Another member, a woman with a steely demeanor, spoke next. "You've emphasized diversity as a key component of your strategy. That's admirable. But do you think it's truly profitable? This is Europe, after all." The question was thinly veiled, and Eliza knew it wasn't just about profitability. It was about her, about whether someone like her, with her perspective, could succeed in their world. Eliza took a slow breath before responding. "Diversity isn't just a buzzword," she said. "It's a business imperative. The markets that have embraced it are outperforming those that haven't. What I'm offering isn't just profitability. It's sustainability." The pushback. The questions continued, some fair, others laced with subtle condescension. Eliza answered each one with poise. But she could feel the fatigue creeping in. It wasn't just the questions themselves. It was the implication behind them. The unspoken test of her competence. Her legitimacy. Her right to sit at this table. And then, inevitably, it came. A man seated at the far end of the table, older and clearly the most senior, leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "Ms. Freeman," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of authority. "Your credentials are impressive, and your proposal is thorough. But tell me, what do you believe sets you apart from the others who have come before you?" It was a question laden with layers. One that demanded more than a professional answer. It wasn't about her proposal, it was about her. About whether she could convince them that she was not just capable, but exceptional. Because for people like her, being exceptional was the only way to survive. The response. Eliza let the question hang in the air for a moment. Meeting his gaze evenly. "What sets me apart?" she began, her voice calm but firm. "Is that I've spent my entire career navigating spaces where I was underestimated. I've learned to see opportunities where others see obstacles. I've built something from the ground up in an industry that wasn't built for me. And I've done it not by playing it safe, but by taking risks that others were too afraid to take." Her words landed with quiet force, the room falling silent as they absorbed the weight of what she had said. "I'm not here to prove I belong," she continued. "I'm here because I've already proven it. Now, I'm offering you the chance to join me." The aftermath. The meeting concluded an hour later. The board members retreating to deliberate. Eliza remained in the room, her hands resting lightly on the table as she stared out the window. Her heart was steady, but her mind raced with thoughts of what had just transpired. She had done everything she could, but she knew that her fate, in this moment, was in their hands. Etienne Moreau returned alone, his expression unreadable. "Madam Freeman," he said, "the board will need time to review your proposal. But I must say, your presentation was compelling." "Thank you," Eliza replied, her tone measured. She stood and extended her hand, meeting his gaze with quiet determination. As she left the building and stepped back into the crisp Geneva air, Eliza allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The test wasn't over, but she had met this challenge with the same strength that had carried her through so many others. She knew the battle she was fighting wasn't just about business. It was about changing the unspoken rules of a world that still struggled to see her for who she was. And who she was determined to become. The cafe across from Eliza Freeman's hotel was modest but refined. Its outdoor tables shaded by crimson umbrellas. The smell of freshly baked bread lingered in the air, blending with the faint scent of flowers from a nearby planter. Eliza sat at a corner table, her coffee untouched, as she scrolled through emails on her tablet. Despite the scenic surroundings, her mind was far from the present moment. The meeting with the board lingered like a heavy shadow. Though she had delivered her presentation flawlessly, the unspoken challenges she faced in that room refused to fade. She had walked into the boardroom armed with data, experience, and poise. But what she truly confronted wasn't just skepticism about her ideas. It was skepticism about her. It wasn't her proposal they questioned, it was her existence in their world. The encounter. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar sound, the soft scrape of a chair being pulled across the pavement. She glanced up to see a man, middle-aged and impeccably dressed, settling into the seat across from her uninvited. His silver hair gleamed in the late morning sun and his eyes carried the sharpness of someone accustomed to wielding authority. "Ms. Freeman," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "I hope I'm not intruding." She recognized him immediately, Victor Leclerc, one of the more skeptical members of the board. He had spoken sparingly during the meeting, his questions pointed but carefully worded. "You are," Eliza said, her tone polite but firm. "But you're here now, so I assume you have something important to say." Victor smiled faintly, as if amused by her response. He folded his hands on the table, his posture relaxed yet deliberate. "I wanted to commend you on your presentation," he said. "You're clearly very capable." "Thank you," Eliza replied, her expression neutral. She had heard this kind of compliment before, one that seemed to acknowledge her competence while simultaneously underlining how surprising it was. Victor leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "But I have to ask," he continued, "don't you ever feel Out of place? In rooms like that? There it was. The subtle dagger cloaked in civility. Eliza tilted her head slightly. Her gaze steady. Out of place? She repeated. Her tone even. Why would I feel that way? Victor hesitated, as if considering how to frame his next words. You must admit, he said finally, that those rooms, our world, are not traditional, accommodating to someone with your background. Eliza set her tablet down, folding her hands neatly in front of her. Mr. Leclerc, she began, her voice calm but edged with steel. I've spent my entire career in rooms that weren't accommodating. I've learned to navigate them, to excel in them, and to make them mine. If anything, it's the people in those rooms who should feel out of place when they underestimate me. Victor's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair. Touché, he said with a slight nod. But you must understand, it's not personal, it's just the way things are. The way things are, Eliza echoed, her tone sharpening. And who decides that? Mr. Leclerc? You? People like you? The unspoken rules you cling to are nothing more than barriers designed to protect those who benefit from them. For a moment, Victor said nothing. Around them, the sounds of the cafe continued. A waiter taking orders, the distant clatter of cups. But at their table, the air felt heavier, charged. The reflection, as Victor finally rose to leave, offering a faint, I'll see you at the follow-up meeting. Eliza watched him go with a mixture of frustration and resolve. His words had been coated in civility, but they were no less corrosive for their polite packaging. They were a reminder of the constant battle she fought. Not just to be heard, but to be seen for what she truly was. It wasn't anger that lingered as she returned to her hotel room, it was exhaustion. The quiet, gnawing fatigue of pushing against a tide that never seemed to recede. Eliza sat by the window, staring out at the city. The Alps loomed in the distance, their peaks catching the light in a way that felt both majestic and unyielding. She thought of her journey, the boardroom, the cafe, the years of proving and reproving herself in spaces that questioned her every step. But she also thought of the women who had come before her, who had fought battles far harder than hers, with far fewer resources. Their stories were etched into her resolve, a constant reminder that the fight was worth it. The shift. That evening, Eliza received a call from Marcus, her trusted advisor. His voice was steady, but there was an urgency beneath it. The board has requested a second meeting, he said. Apparently, there's been some debate. Eliza's lips pressed into a thin line. She had expected resistance, but not this quickly. Debate about what? She asked. Your proposal, Marcus replied. And, by extension, you. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Eliza closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. Let them debate, she said finally. I'll be ready. As she hung up, Eliza felt the familiar fire reignite within her. She was tired, yes, but she was also resolute. The invisible rules, the quiet doubts, the unspoken judgments, they were all part of the world she sought to change. And she would change it, not by conforming to their expectations, but by shattering them. The boardroom looked the same as it had 2 days prior, its polished mahogany table gleaming under soft lights, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline of Geneva in an indifferent tableau. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air felt thicker, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to witness what was about to unfold. Eliza Freeman entered with her usual poise, her tailored navy dress offset by a gold brooch on her lapel. She was unhurried, deliberate, her heels tapping softly against the marble floor. The 11 board members were already seated, their expressions guarded, their postures betraying a range of emotions, from thinly veiled skepticism to faint curiosity. The chair at the head of the table was left open for her. She took it without hesitation, placing her leather portfolio on the table with a sense of ownership that wasn't asked for but demanded. Thank you for reconvening so quickly, Eliza said, her voice steady but firm. We thought it necessary, Etienne Moreau replied, his silver hair catching the light as he spoke. Your proposal is compelling, Ms. Freeman, but there are concerns, questions that need addressing before we proceed. Eliza nodded, leaning forward slightly. Then let's address them. The questions that weren't questions. The first half hour of the meeting unfolded in a rhythm Eliza had come to know all too well. The board's questions came one after another, couched in polite phrasing but sharp in their subtext. Your vision for market expansion is ambitious. One member said. Do you think it might be overly optimistic? Another chimed in. We've reviewed the financial models. And while they are promising, they hinge on a level of cultural resonance that isn't guaranteed. What happens if it fails? Eliza responded to each question with precision, her voice calm but unyielding. She knew these weren't questions about strategy or feasibility. They were about her, about whether she, a black woman from a world so far removed from theirs, had the audacity to think she could reshape theirs. Her answers were met with nods, some more begrudging than others. But she could feel the resistance beneath their approval, like an undertow waiting to drag her back. Victor's challenge. It was Victor Leclerc, seated to her right, who finally voiced what the others hadn't dared to say aloud. Ms. Freeman, he began, his tone measured but sharp. Your credentials and presentation are impressive. As I said before, but business, as you know, isn't just about numbers. It's about relationships, trust, culture. He paused, letting the word linger in the air, its unspoken implications heavy with judgment. And I wonder, he continued, leaning back in his chair, whether your vision aligns with the culture of this institution. Our clientele, our values, they are built on certain traditions. Do you believe you can integrate into that? The room fell silent, the other members glancing at Victor, then at Eliza. The question was as much an accusation as it was an inquiry. And everyone knew it. The response. Eliza took a deep breath, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. She met Victor's gaze with a calm intensity that made him shift slightly in his chair. Mr. Leclerc, she began, her voice quiet but resonant. You speak of culture as though it is a fixed thing, as though it is immune to change. But the truth is, culture evolves. It must. It evolves to meet the needs of the world it serves. Her words hung in the air for a moment before she continued. I've built my career by recognizing the gaps in those traditions you hold so dear. The spaces where people are excluded, overlooked, dismissed. I've succeeded not despite those gaps but because I've learned to navigate them, to bridge them. And now, I'm offering you the opportunity to do the same. She leaned back slightly, her gaze unwavering. This isn't about whether I can integrate into your culture. It's about whether your culture is ready to grow. The aftershock. The room remained silent for several seconds, the weight of her words settling over the table like a dense fog. Victor's expression flickered, first with surprise, then with something closer to respect, though he masked it quickly. Etienne Moreau broke the silence, clearing his throat. Thank you, Ms. Freeman, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Your perspective is illuminating. Eliza inclined her head slightly. I'm glad you think so. The subtle sabotage. As the meeting progressed, Eliza noticed the quiet machinations of dissent. Questions that revisited points she had already addressed. Proposals that subtly undermined her vision while cloaked in the language of collaboration. It wasn't overt. It never was. But it was there. The unspoken challenge of proving herself over and over. Of jumping hurdles that didn't exist for others at the table. By the time the meeting concluded, Eliza felt the strain in her shoulders. The weight of carrying not just her proposal but the burden of expectations placed upon her. The quiet resolve. Back in her hotel room, Eliza stood by the window, staring out at the city as night fell. The lights of Geneva twinkled below, their glow a reminder of the world she was fighting to reshape. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she turned to see a message from Marcus. How did it go? Eliza typed her response slowly, her fingers lingering on each letter. It went as expected. She set the phone down and took a deep breath. The road ahead was clear, but it was also long, and she would walk it, as she always had, with her head high and her resolve unshaken. The streets of Geneva glowed softly in the pre-dawn light, a blend of old-world charm and modern precision. Eliza Freeman walked briskly along the cobblestone path leading to the hotel's private conference room, her breath visible in the crisp air. She had hardly slept. The weight of the second board meeting clung to her like a heavy cloak. each interaction replaying in her mind as she prepared for what lay ahead. Today wasn't about her proposal anymore, it was about control. The stakes had been raised. The unspoken tensions of the previous day hinted at a resistance deeper and more insidious than she had anticipated. It wasn't just her vision they questioned, it was her right to shape theirs. The private meeting. Inside the conference room, the air was warm but carried an edge of formality. 2 members of the board had requested a private discussion with her. Claudine Duval and Richard Halstead. Both influential voices in the organization. Claudine was sharp and analytical. Her every word calculated, while Richard's demeanor was gruff. His authority rooted in decades of experience. Eliza greeted them with her usual poise, masking the unease bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She could sense that this meeting wasn't just about clarifications or adjustments, it was about boundaries. Ms. Freeman, Claudine began, her tone brisk but polite. We appreciate your time this morning. We felt it was important to address a few concerns that have arisen. Eliza nodded, folding her hands neatly on the table. Of course. What would you like to discuss? Claudine exchanged a glance with Richard, who leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the polished surface of the table. Let's not mince words, Richard said, his voice steady but heavy with implication. There's been some apprehension among the board about your approach. It's bold, perhaps even too bold for an organization of our history and stature. Eliza tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Boldness is often necessary for progress, she replied. Richard leaned back, his eyes narrowing. True, but boldness must also be tempered with caution. We've built something here, something enduring. Change, while inevitable, must be incremental, controlled. The tightrope. The conversation unfolded like a delicate dance, each step laden with meaning. Claudine and Richard voiced concerns that were ostensibly about strategy but were, in truth, about power. They spoke of tradition, of preserving the essence of the organization, all while subtly questioning whether Eliza's vision was compatible with that essence. Eliza answered each point with precision, but she could feel the tension mounting. This wasn't a dialogue, it was a test. A quiet, relentless push to see if she would bend, if she would acquiesce to the invisible rules they were so desperate to uphold. As the discussion wore on, Claudine's tone softened, but the edge in her words remained. You must understand, Ms. Freeman, that this organization has thrived because it has maintained its identity. We've weathered storms by staying true to who we are. Eliza's lips curved into a faint smile. And who are you, exactly? The question hung in the air, sharper than any accusation. Claudine blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We are a legacy, Claudine said finally, her voice measured, a symbol of excellence. Excellence, Eliza echoed, her tone cool. Excellence isn't static. It's not something you achieve and then preserve like a relic. It's something you continually redefine. And that requires more than holding on to the past. It requires embracing the future. The sabotage. As the private meeting ended, Eliza felt the subtle shift in their demeanor. They had heard her, but they hadn't listened. Their smiles were polite, their words cordial, but beneath it all, she sensed the undercurrent of resistance. A silent agreement to undermine her without appearing to do so. The rest of the day unfolded like a series of small, calculated challenges. Emails went unanswered. Key documents she requested were delayed. A scheduled call with an important partner was mysteriously rescheduled, without her knowledge. It wasn't overt, but it was coordinated. Eliza recognized it for what it was. Sabotage. The kind that didn't shout but whispered. The kind that chipped away at her authority, her confidence, her resolve, hoping she wouldn't notice until it was too late. The confrontation. By late afternoon, Eliza had had enough. She walked into Etienne Moreau's office unannounced. Her steps firm, her gaze unwavering. Ms. Freeman, Etienne said, startled but recovering quickly. Is there something I can help you with? Yes, Eliza replied, her voice steady but firm. I'd like to know why certain members of your team seem more interested in obstructing my work than in collaborating with me. Etienne's expression flickered. Surprise, guilt, then composure. I assure you, Ms. Freeman, any delays or miscommunications are purely unintentional. These things happen in large organizations. They happen when people let them happen. Eliza said sharply. I didn't come here to play politics. Mr. Moreau, I came here to do the work that your organization claims to value. If that's not what you want, tell me now, but if it is, then it's time to decide whether you're willing to back words with action. Etienne stared at her for a long moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. Finally, he nodded, a hint of resignation in his eyes. You have my support, Ms. Freeman. I'll address the matter immediately. The reflection. That evening, as Eliza sat in her hotel room, the city lights casting faint shadows across the walls, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. She had fought harder than she should have needed to that day. But she had also held her ground. The fight wasn't over. It never was. But she had learned long ago that change didn't come easily. It came in increments, in battles fought and won one at a time. As she stared out at the skyline, she thought of the unspoken rules that had shaped the world she navigated. They were persistent, yes, but they weren't unbreakable, and Eliza Freeman had never been one to play by rules designed to keep her out. The final day in Geneva was shrouded in a cold, misting rain that muted the city's vibrancy. For Eliza Freeman, it mirrored her mood, subdued, reflective, yet quietly resolute. The follow-up meeting with the board loomed. The culmination of a week filled with subtle battles, strategic maneuvering, and an ever-present undercurrent of resistance. Eliza wasn't new to this. She had built a career navigating spaces that whispered rather than shouted their hostility. But this particular boardroom, with its veneer of European civility, had tested her patience in ways she hadn't expected. The third meeting. The boardroom was quieter this time, its occupants subdued in the aftermath of Eliza's confrontation with Etienne Moreau. As she entered, she felt their gazes on her, measuring, calculating. She wasn't just a colleague to them. She was a force they couldn't quite define, a challenge to their carefully constructed sense of normalcy. Etienne rose to open the meeting, his voice carrying the deliberate tone of someone attempting to restore order. Thank you all for coming, he began. We're here to finalize our decision on Ms. Freeman's proposal. The statement was simple, but the room's energy was not. Eliza could feel the tension crackling beneath the surface, the quiet power struggles playing out in sidelong glances and stiff postures. The final pushback. Victor Leclerc, ever the skeptic, was the first to speak. Ms. Freeman, he began, his tone measured. Your vision is undoubtedly ambitious. But there remains a question of fit. How do you intend to align your approach with the culture and legacy of this institution? It was a question that masqueraded as professional but was, in truth, deeply personal. Eliza recognized it for what it was. A final attempt to force her to defend not just her ideas, but her presence in their world. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping across the table. With all due respect, Mr. Leclerc, she said, her voice calm but firm. This isn't a question of whether I can align with your culture. It's a question of whether your culture is ready to align with the world as it is today. The room fell silent, her words landing with the weight of undeniable truth. The decision, the deliberation was swift, though it felt agonizingly slow. Eliza sat in the room as the board whispered among themselves, their voices too low to catch but their body language telling. When Etienne finally stood to announce their decision, his expression was a careful mask. Ms. Freeman, he said, the board has voted to approve your proposal. A murmur rippled through the room, a mixture of surprise and resignation. Eliza inclined her head, her face betraying nothing. Thank you, she said simply. The reckoning. Later that evening, Eliza sat in her hotel room, staring out at the rain-slicked streets of Geneva. The victory felt hollow, not because it wasn't earned, but because of the relentless fight it had required. Her phone buzzed with messages of congratulations from Marcus and other colleagues. Yet her mind lingered on the unspoken challenges she had faced, the barriers that remained. She knew this was only the beginning. She thought of the women and men who had come before her, who had fought similar battles in boardrooms, classrooms, and courthouses. Their struggles had paved the way for her. But the road remained unfinished. The reflection. In the quiet of that rainy night, Eliza made a decision. This wasn't just about her success. It was about reshaping the spaces she entered, ensuring that the next person who looked like her wouldn't have to fight as hard. The next morning, as her flight ascended above the Alps, Eliza stared out the window at the vast, unyielding landscape below. The challenges ahead were daunting, but so was her resolve. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the beginning.